forgot is that I also work for industry in a short spell, so be warned. No, thanks for the introduction. It's true that I've seen many aspects and phases of campus management through my life, including prioritization, including grouping, a lot of data management, and a lot of NAMs. But here I also have to confess that the NAM discussion is not only about speed, it's a lot driven by animal and replacing animal testing. So I know a bit about human health toxicology, and one reason to come here is actually to learn more from the environmental side of things. So I've been exposed minimalistically, but I'm here. But I'm with a colleague, Kostas, who actually really knows. So all the tricky questions will go to him. I'm the director of hazard assessment, which includes evaluation, all REACH evaluation activities, the CLP activities, SVHC identification, and POPs and everything else. And I think what I'm going to do is probably not so much talk about our experiences with prioritization, but more textualizing what the ultimate outcome is. Because, and Hans-Peter mentioned it, there is now the CLP criteria, the CLP, the PMP integrated into CLP, which makes it law. So one of the things I want to talk about is what does that mean when something becomes law? How does that interact with research? The other thing I want to explain is a little bit more about ECHA and what we believe our role is and how this is evolving in the area between implementing law and the research. Again, one of the reasons why we're here, even with two people, which is quite unusual. But it shows how much we are interested in this project. So, I guess most of you know ECHA. I still want to put a little bit of a perspective of what ECHA is and what it is not. Here are some metrics on the size of it. So around 600 staff, 128 million euros revenue. And we're governed by both the management board, which consists of member states, representation and commission, and our direct masters are the European Commission, predominantly DG GROWS, but also other DGs. We work with other agencies, obviously, and we have quite some collaboration with other agencies from other countries, US and Canada specifically. What is our mandate? I will not, don't worry, I will not go through this as such, but what is important is that in the first instance, ECHA implements the laws that were made in Brussels. So we don't make the law, we implement it. When laws are being designed, we can give input on technical, scientific considerations. But our predominant task is to implement it. We have to do that transparently and all the usual things that you can expect from an institution. We collaborate, we provide tools to do so. And the last point is really ensure relevant, reliable, and objective information is available. So it's a lot about executing what is in the law and make sure that you do it robustly, transparently, and all of it. So this is the core of our mandate. So if you don't like what is in the CLP, you can talk to us, but we cannot change it. We can say to the Commission, there are people that don't like it, but we cannot change it. A little bit, you know, the evolution of ECHA, we started with REACH, that you know, then we quickly got CLP, which is perhaps for you, some of you, something new. And then we slowly but surely got other tasks. And again, I will not walk you through it, but it's just to illustrate that more and more we get more tasks, all related to the assessment of chemicals. And as we speak, we are expecting to receive more tasks coming our way. So we are not only a REACH agency or CLP agency, it's more generic. It's chemical safety, well, first the purpose. We protect health and the environment through our work for chemical safety, which is broader than REACH. That's the point of it. Then the other thing, and this new strategy is relatively recent, even though we're very much focused on implementation, we now have a vision that says chemical safety through science, collaboration, and knowledge. So here you already start to hopefully sense that we are execution, but probably it is good to invest more in the collaboration and in the exchange with stakeholders, interested parties. So we've defined goals as you do in your strategy, and again, nothing will be shocking to you, but where here you again can recognize the lead on chemical knowledge and expertise, advancing knowledge is something that pops up. The collaboration pops up as something new. So this is where ECHA will always be implementing and will always be executing the law, but has realized that probably needs to be more exchange, collaboration with member states, with industry, with NGOs, and definitely with the research and research and development side of things. So now to my talk, and I go through a little bit, and this is the other way around. I start with what is the ultimate way of regulating, because already in the opening we talked a lot about finding chemicals that then need to be regulated. And it is all of this workshop and this work is all about that. But I already want to give you a bit of a sense and perspective of what does that mean then. So classification labeling, it was mentioned, there is some overlap with Hans Peter's slide, so I'll go through them relatively quickly. But we're already doing classification and labeling in Europe since 1967, sort of. But early years we started to say this particular chemical has this hazard, and therefore it has these consequences. The other thing it says is that here are a bunch of rules, you need to look at your chemical, and you yourself need to conclude, for the ones that Europe didn't do, you need to conclude what the hazards are. So the classification and labeling approach has two arms. One of them is where there is a so-called harmonized classification, where in Europe there is a decision that a chemical is repro or is PMT, and that's law. And if your chemical has not been addressed through the harmonization, then there are rules where you yourself as industry need to apply the rules and come to a classification. So those are the two arms. So this started initially in Europe in the 67548. I'm old and I use jargon, so that is how I call this thing. The other thing, at some point in parallel, this was transferred into a globally harmonized system. At least that's the intent. At least it has been there. It's still there, I should say. And it's still the ambition. It goes with ups and downs, but the ambition is good. To actually try to, not this list of chemicals should be classified like this, but the rules on how you actually do the classification to make them globally. There is not only a protection element here, but also a trade element, obviously. This has led to an update of our own classification labeling, where the GHS was introduced in Europe. What is the CLP? We call it in Europe, it's the CLP, so the Classification, Labeling and Packaging Regulation. And it is this harmonization of hazard classification and labeling through the rules and through this Annex 6, that contains this list of substances that are harmonized. So what do? Again, not to be bureaucratic about it, but to be clear when we have the exchange on what does ECHA now do in this process and what not, to make sure that the right expectations. So it's the member states who develop the proposals of substances or group of substances, and we try to support them and help them, and often they are happy with that, sometimes they are annoyed with us, and that's how that goes. I see some people laughing, so I probably hit the spot. And then we do the actual processing of it in terms of the administration. And we try to what we try to do is ensure consistency, transparency, make sure that it is CLP compliant. And then we support the process that ends up in the risk assessment committee, which is a committee of independent experts that ultimately decide what the classification of these chemicals are. Ultimately, they come with an opinion, which then goes to the commission, who then takes the formal decision of making this law. So in ECHA, we do not perform tests or stuff like that. We don't select substances. We might support the member states if they have IDs, but we're not the ones selecting the substances. We do not decide that this classification, it should be this or that classification. That's the RUC. We're not the RUC. And again, we do not generate data, but we also do not request the generation of data. We don't make the decisions. And for sure, we do not perform risk assessment in all of this. It's purely a hazard identification. So classification labeling does not have a socio-economic assessment. Is a substance is a reprotoxin? It is a reprotoxin. What you do with that information in terms of a socio-economic impact, that's a different story. It's not CLP. The process, we like processes and steps and clarity and who does what, because we have to do many of those, so we need to be not only efficient but also transparent. Again, I will not go into an awful lot of detail, but there is explicit roles and responsibilities for everybody. There is the point of consultation where people can give input. And we have realized that we need to be more explicit in explaining this, because more and more people start to react at the end of the process. And that's rather unfortunate, because we went through all the assessments, many people, a lot of data was assessed by many people, and then we come to a conclusion. So this consultation, and when is the consultation and when it is not, is an important part of this. In the latest update of the CLP, we introduced the hazard classes. Hans-Peter already mentioned it, the PMP and the BPM. This I don't have to explain to you. You know this all better than me. That why are we doing all of this? So I will really go through this relatively quick. This led to hazard statements, and you see the last two, the new ones, which are relevant for the work here. And this is exactly the protection that we try to achieve. Maybe another thing I didn't mention is that one of the roles of classification labeling is that it informs what happens with the substance in terms of risk management. By law, but also at a local level within companies themselves. So by law, and I don't, for PMP, VPM, VPVM, I don't think this is clarified yet, but I'll give you another example, again, human health, I won't you, my apologies. But if a substance is, for instance, a CMR category 1, which is the most severe one, this has automatic consequences that you're not allowed to use it in certain situations anymore. The other consequence is that if at a company level, you need to do record keeping, risk assessments in a certain way. So the hazard identification classification through classifications on these hazard statements has a direct consequence of what you can do with the substance and what not, and how you should handle it. The criteria, the point here is no more that the P criteria, at least in the context of REACH, we've seen them. The purple one, the toxicity criteria, have been mostly updated to integrate the endocrine disruptors, but as such they are well known. And the mobility is a new criteria. The KOC value, and Hans-Peter mentioned it, it's a very simple measurement of very clear cutoffs. And I had a discussion yesterday evening with Hans-Peter about that, and I explained that if you want to regulate ultimately, you will need to have a clear boundary, a clear cutoff. Realizing that, especially around this cutoff, there might be a discussion. Realizing that for some of these substances, perhaps this is not the right way of doing it. But if you don't have an explicit cutoff criteria that you put in law, the process of managing these substances through regulation becomes very, very difficult. And to illustrate, we do around, the RAC does around 30 industrial chemicals classifications per year. At the moment, at least 2 of them end up in Luxembourg in the Court of Justice. So more and more, when there is a decision on this chemical has this classification, it ends up in court. The court in principle should not do the scientific assessment as such, because we have the RAC for that. But the more explicit and the more straightforward the rules are, the better it is when you end up in this situation. But it already starts before that. I think what is really beneficial for companies when it comes to any law is predictability. Anybody from a company will say, I need predictability. I need to know what I'm getting myself into when I develop a product. No. So that is why you will see in regulation often cutoffs that are simple, sometimes simplified, and there are consequences and there are issues, but the heart or the fundamental backbone of it is you need to be able to regulate so that everybody has clear expectations of what will happen in what situation. Now, that was my operational ECHA. Now, the other ECHA says, knowing this, you still need to use science to underpin these things, but also to then implement them and to know where it goes wrong and all that. So that is an area where it is not only about drawing the line and it's left or right. There still needs to be understanding of what that means. Yeah, this is to illustrate that it's not only about the cutoff as such, but there are of course, opportunities to integrate other pieces of information in a way that evidence approach. And I need to do that. Now, with every law, we need to explain what the law means or what we think the law means. So we have guidance documents, and then there is always the disclaimer that a guidance is not a law. But at the same time, it really has a value in clarifying, again, expectations of what we think needs to be done. So we've updated the CLP guidance with all the other changes, and we're almost there with the update of the guidance related to the PMT, VPVM, and the other parts. So we don't just do an update of a guidance as ECHA, it's a whole process. It starts with a draft. It goes through different levels of consultations. We have experts. It goes through the CARICAL, which is the collection of the Commission and the competent authority. So it goes through different rounds of discussion and negotiation until the ultimate publication. It says autumn. Kostas, when we are about to finalize it, within a week, what was it again?
By the end of October, it should be published.
By the end of October, it should be published. We are right here first. So this slide, yeah, this is what I said. So the guidance development is on its way, it's almost there. Now the guidance is not the end of the story. The guidance is the start. So we put it in law. So first there's a lot of research and development going on, and there is a realization this is an issue. At some point you put something in the law with clear cutoffs so that people know what to expect. There is guidance development around it that tries to explain what are you going to do with all of this now. And this will be updated as we move on. All the guidances have been updated, new insights, etc. So the guidance, there we can talk with ECHA that perhaps there should be further developments, but not for the next coming months, please. But as we move forward. The first cases that really will go to the CLH, so this harmonized classification process, there have been intentions by member states, 3 or 4 or something like that, but during the breakfast we already heard about a few others, so I think member states are really gearing up to bring the substances for P, and I'm talking about PMT. I said this in a different way earlier, so the role of all of this is to say, this chemical has this hazard, and that's either by people themselves applying the rules, or you're on a list where Europe says this chemical has this hazard, and then it has all the consequences of that. Also biocides and pesticides, substances are classified. And the idea is to slowly but surely go to a system where the hazard of a substance is independent from the use. One substance, one assessment, you heard about it. And one vehicle is to ensure a harmonized classification for all these chemicals at once. So pesticides and biocides, in principle, they are all classified. They tend to have intrinsic properties that lead to effects of some sort. Industrial chemicals, there are so many of them, it's 12,000 in our database at the moment, so you need to prioritize. Now, the regulatory system. So, we have registered substances in the top corner, which is a database, 12,000 substances, and we have some other information. We have started to do grouping, like anybody else. Canada has been grouping, the EPA has been grouping substances for years. There is quite some discussion on grouping and read across and all that, and I think it's mostly caused by not putting it in perspective, or in context, I should say. When you group to really show that these substances are reprotoxic, and you want to put that in law, that's probably a different level of scrutiny and proof than if you say, I want to prioritize substances and then see what the problem is. So, to illustrate the last one, you could do chemical similarity is enough, because then you start to continue to work. You could say, it depends on the context. If you really want to prove that a substance is or is not, it's even more difficult. Not scientifically, but regulatory, it's more difficult to prove that a substance doesn't have an effect. Then what you need to put together in terms of proving this becomes a different story. And I think for this workshop, it's still about creativity and thinking about what are the options. Once you go down the regulatory path of saying, but now these substances should be banned, or something like that, then what is read across the grouping becomes a different thing. That's just a warning for the coming years, I guess. We grouped, and then we see, what is our first impression. And if we think we need more data, we have processes on the top, and they are mostly with me in ECHA, where we say we want to generate data. And there are mechanisms in reach to do this. Compliance check, substance evaluation, and through PPP and ED assessment, we can have an idea of what kind of data we should need. Once we've done that, many of them are actually deemed to be okay, and we put them back in the pool, and that's fine. And some of them we try to regulate, and we try to regulate more and more as groups. It was mentioned earlier. It's to be more efficient, more impactful, to avoid regrettable substitution, and all. But it's hard to regulate. It's doable to prioritize our groups, regulate the groups. That's hard, and it should be harder because it's all about fair expectations of if you say this chemical causes this problem, what level of evidence do you need for that? Now that's the regulatory process and lawyers and all that context. But there's still a connection with regulatory needs, or still, there is even more connection with regulatory needs. And for ECHA, this in a way I've said, we implement law and we use science to make the argumentation. So it's really the other way around, almost. It's based on hazard exposure and risk, all of that is obvious. But in all that context, we need to further development of models, methods, and data. We have new concerns, EMP, relatively new concerns, ED. We have a drive to reduce or even abandon animal testing. So there are many policy drives to innovate and to go further. So what are in ECHA the drivers for the regulatory science? Well, we put it in our strategy statement. It's put here better than I said it earlier. It is part of the chemical strategy of sustainability. It has a number of topics listed there that call for more science, and I mentioned a few of them earlier. The legal requirements changing, I said all of that, and be aware of the advances in science. So one of the first interactions for us was with PARC, and you all know it, so I'm not going to explain it, unless somebody stands up and says, I've never heard about PARC. I cannot believe it. Our role, our very modest role, is to try to advise on what is regulatory relevant, because it's an enormous amount of money, an enormous amount of project, and what we try to do modestly is to say, this could be interesting, this perhaps less from our point of view. When we were doing PARC, we realized that it might be good to draft a document where we upfront say, we believe these are our needs. So we published a document which is called Key Area of Regulatory Challenge. We update this, even though science takes its time, we update this. It's on our website, and we try to describe what we believe we need research and development to meet the challenges that I mentioned earlier. The one that I highlight, the one area that I highlight is the addressing chemical pollution in the environment. Bioaccumulation, I have understood, is an evergreen. In that sense, it's an area, and the one that probably touches most here is developments in monitoring, development of approaches of monitoring. Already heard it before. There is the expanding protection of biodiversity by the use of NAMs is connected to the T, which is not part of the workshop per se, and that is a bit the other way around. That because of the human health NAM work that we did, we've realized that through the genomics work, there is perhaps a promise to be more protective, or at least have a better understanding across several species. So to work better in the cross-species mindset. And the bees is another topic that comes with. The other thing that we have started to do, which is new, is to actually contract. So there is PARC. We do a lot of collaborations with the EPA and Health Canada and others, but we still felt that it would be good to have a modest amount of money to do really specific projects. So we have a framework contract. I think it's now closed, where we have, for the different areas, we're contracting somewhere. We're not going to be a research organization, by far not, but it is just to illustrate that we're opening up a bit to make these connections and these collaborations. Which brings me finally to the ZeroPM project. We're here to observe and learn. We have to help member states in putting this in law. I try to illustrate a little bit the goods and the bads of that and the challenges of that. I think it's only the beginning. So for that, we followed the project until now. We're more interested, and as I said at the introduction, the reason for me to come is really to listen more, because I can contribute to the discussions from a more abstract, computation.
ZeroPM, Zero Pollution of Persistent and Mobile Substances. This project has received funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme under Grant Agreement number 101036756.